At least 38 people have been killed in Khan Yunis on Friday following a series of overnight attacks.
The head of the European Commission is expected to arrive in Serbia as part of a tour of the Balkans promoting EU enlargement.
Strictly for European purposes. How the European Parliament is funding its elected members.
At least 38 people have been killed in Khan Yunis on Friday in an Israeli airstrike, according to Gazan health officials. The strike is the latest in a series of massive overnight attacks in Gaza. Earlier in the night, Israeli forces struck a school as well as homes in the Jabalia refugee camp and stormed the Kamal Adwan hospital in northern Gaza, forcing its patients to evacuate. 3 journalists of the Beirut-based Al Mayadeen TV were also killed in Lebanon on Friday. Lebanon's information minister called the attack on the compound, which houses several media organizations, a war crime. Meanwhile, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken met with Lebanon's caretaker Prime Minister Najib Mikati in London following a trip to the Middle East. He was in Qatar on Thursday, where he said he is expecting the revival of ceasefire talks between Israel and Hamas in the coming days.
Enlargement will remain.
President of the European Commission Ursula von der Leyen is expected to arrive in Serbia as part of a tour of the Balkans promoting EU enlargement. Von der Leyen's expected visit to Serbia comes only a day after visiting Bosnia and Herzegovina as well as North Macedonia. Whilst in North Macedonia, von der Leyen said the country had made great progress in implementing reforms necessary to join the EU. Von der Leyen said the EU was committed to its enlargement plans and it will be the Union's top priority. The Commission President also visited a central Bosnian village after it was devastated by recent floods and landslides, saying the EU stood with the country. After the disaster claimed 27 lives, Bosnia sought EU aid and many countries sent teams to help through the EU's civil protection mechanism. President of the European Parliament Roberta Metsola met with Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni to discuss the main issues facing Europe. The European leaders discussed topics ranging from Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine to the crisis in the Middle East and the situation in Venezuela. Metsola made an appearance on local radio following the meeting to share what had been addressed. She described how solutions to immigration issues facing Europe must be found, and said neither Malta nor Italy should be made to feel alone, as the management of migratory flows was a European challenge. The European Parliament head also stressed the importance of the EU continuing to call for de-escalation in the Middle East, as well as continued humanitarian aid. Metsola also said Italy's pick for the European Commission, Raffaele Fitto, would do an excellent job as Commissioner and highlighted the importance of giving vice presidency to Italy.
Bulgarians are heading to the polls on Sunday for the 7th time in 3 years. Bulgaria is in dire need of a period of stable government to accelerate the flow of EU funds in recovery and resilience plan payments, and to speed up the process to join the euro. Ever since mass anti-corruption protests in 2020 toppled Bulgaria's center-right government, a series of elections led to unstable and unsuccessful coalitions led by centrist and right-wing parties. Nikolai Denko, former prime minister and leader of the We Continue the Change coalition, said a series of laws relating to climate and corruption need to be passed as soon as possible and sent to the European Commission. The last elections were held in June, when turnout stood at a record low of 34%. The latest polls suggest not much will change, with the same 3 parties in the lead. The current coalition's GERB party, whose leader is Bulgaria's longest-serving prime minister since the fall of the Soviet Union, is expected to win the most votes. The pro-Russian right-wing Revival Party is also growing, with approval for the EU reaching an all-time low in Bulgaria at 46%. All the running party leaders have held their final pitches in the lead-up to Sunday's vote.
Georgia is heading to the polls on Saturday in a parliamentary election many citizens believe will be the most crucial vote of their lifetimes. The election will pit a coalition of opposition parties against the ruling Georgian dream, which many fear is dragging the nation towards authoritarianism and away from the European Union. Brussels put Georgia's bid for entry to the EU on hold indefinitely in August after the ruling government passed a Russian law cracking down on freedom of speech earlier this year. Georgian Dream argue it needed to curb harmful foreign actors trying to destabilise the country. But journalists and activists say its true goal is to stigmatise them and restrict debate before the election. Many Georgians fear that if the Georgian Dream Party is re-elected, hopes of joining the EU could be permanently extinguished.
This year, an election year, the funds allocated by the European Parliament to the political groups represented in it were paid out on a half-yearly basis rather than annually. The June election was a game-changer, with some, mostly right-wing groups, winning seats in the chamber and others losing, such as the Greens and the Liberals of the Renew group. The bulk of these funds is distributed in proportion to the number of MEPs in the group. During the 6-month period, the European Parliament has paid out 31 million euros to the 7 political groups and to non-attached members. The European People's Party, as the biggest group, received more than 8 million euros. The Social Democrats received almost 6 million, and the far-right, Patriots for Europe, received 3.7 million. At the bottom of the scale, the Europe of Sovereign Nations group, which has 25 MEPs, received 1.17 million euros.
The European Parliament allocates around 65 million euros a year for the support of the political groups. Most of it is distributed proportionally, so 97.5%. 2.5% is distributed in equal shares, but the bulk is distributed in proportion to the number of members of European Parliament that the political group has. So bigger groups get more funding, smaller groups get less funding.
The European Parliament's budget is the only source of funding for political groups and non-attached members. The funds are used to cover administrative and operational costs. They explicitly cannot be used to support national political parties or to finance election campaigns. However, the funds have been misused in the past, and Parliament was forced to implement stricter controls.
In Denmark, the Danish People's Party has used this group funding to support the Facebook campaigns in the run-up to the Danish election, Danish national elections. There have also been similar cases in France, for example, with the Front National back then, so it's quite some time ago, where group funding was also misused for the purpose of the national party and national candidates.
Other funds from the European Parliament are paid directly to MEPs in order to pay their assistants' salaries.
Vice President Kamala Harris rallied in Georgia on Thursday, an important battleground state where she hopes to win over black voters. With less than 2 weeks until Election Day, the race between Harris and Trump is as tight as ever. Polls show conflicting predictions, with Harris narrowly leading some and Trump others. In her speech, Harris had harsh words for her election opponent, comparing him to the predators, fraudsters, and repeat offenders she prosecuted in her early career.
In those roles, I took on perpetrators of all kinds: predators, fraudsters, and repeat offenders. I took them on, and I won. Well, Georgia, in 12 days, it's Donald Trump's turn.
Biden's campaign won Georgia in 2020, becoming the first Democratic presidential candidate to win the southern state since Bill Clinton in 1992. Harris was joined by Bruce Springsteen and also shared the stage with former President Barack Obama for the first time in her campaign, who also did not hold back in his attacks on Trump, calling him a wannabe king and dictator. Harris's campaign is hopeful she can keep Georgia blue in 2024.
The wine-growing town of Cognac in southwestern France is at the epicenter of a trade war between China and the EU. Since mid-October, Beijing has imposed temporary anti-dumping measures for imports of European brandy. This comes after the EU Commission said it wants to impose heavy tariffs on electric vehicles coming from China. Anxiety and frustration against the French government are brewing among cognac makers.
Nous sommes pris en otage d'une situation dans le cadre d'un conflit entre l'Europe et la Chine sur les véhicules électriques. Cognac n'y est strictement pour rien, on est complètement sacrifié. Donc on peut encore rattraper la situation. Il en va de notre gouvernement de trouver des solutions, de se rapprocher de la Chine et de voir quelles discussions il peut y avoir hors Europe. Je rappellerai que la Chine, c'est notre premier marché en valeur, j'insiste beaucoup, notre deuxième en volume.
France is expected to be the country most affected by this decision, with China importing as much as 99% of the spirit last year. That's about 1 billion euros in revenue. In addition to bad weather and harvest this year, cognac makers fear this decision could threaten the future of their profession.
Venir rajouter ce sujet des taxes chinoises qui nous ferait perdre notre deuxième marché, ça entraînerait des conséquences catastrophiques pour tous les opérateurs, viticulteurs, négociants et toute la filière qu'il y a autour de nous.
European brandies such as Armagnac, Italian Grappa, and all other grape spirits will also be overtaxed by China.
Euronews. The news